welcome Rachel as today's presenter. Rachel Robinson teaches at the University of Leeds in the UK and leads the Academic Study Skills module for foundation year students who are preparing for their undergraduate degree courses. She's previously taught English in Spain before relocating to Japan, where she worked at the British Council teaching a range of courses. And she was also an examiner and an exam trainer for both Cambridge English exams and IELTS. And then after working several years in Japan, Japanese universities teaching academic reading, writing, seminar and presentation skills, she returned to the UK to take up her current post at the University of Leeds. So I shall unmute you, Rachel, and over to you.
Hello, thank you, Simon. I hope everybody can hear me okay. So as Simon said, I'm Rachel Robinson and I'm based in Leeds in Yorkshire in the UK, and we have very beautiful weather today for a change, but a little bit chilly, but very pleasant. So welcome to today's webinar, which is focusing on presentations, student presentations. Before I move on to the overview, I'd like to just show you or talk to you a little bit about my context. I'm based at a UK university and I work with the very young students, foundation year students who are about 17, 18 years old, and it's a very high stakes program for them, and it leads them on into their undergraduate studies, hopefully here and in the UK. And we cover a lot of academic study skills in the foundation year, reading, writing, speaking and listening, and of course today I'd like to talk a little bit about presentations. So briefly, I'd like to focus on some of the issues that students have with presentations in my experience, and some of the strategies that I've been trying to incorporate in order to help them become better presenters. So that's really the focus for today. Now, many students, when they come to the UK, they're looking at improving writing skills, grammar, spelling, paragraph writing, and they have to take lots of written exams, of course. This is very important for their studies. However, sometimes it would seem that, sorry, I'll just go back to that slide. Sometimes it would seem that they focus a lot more on these written assignments and not quite so much on the speaking skills. Perhaps this is because speaking is not a permanent record, or perhaps it seems easier. Certainly many students arrive here and they're fluent in the language, but this perhaps might not be the only thing they need in order to be successful with their presentations. For example, I'm sure many of us have been in a situation where students have put lots of time into the preparation, they've spent a long time making slides, they've got all the data, everything they need. They start the presentation, it's an assessed presentation, suddenly the time is up. Perhaps they've lingered too long on one of the more detailed slides, but suddenly they're out of time, and this could be a key assessment for them. So it's really important that they think about how they can work with this. So a few ideas I've had about why they find timing difficult. Perhaps they're just really trying to cram too much information into the presentation rather than choosing and selecting the key points that need to be addressed. Another issue, of course, might be organisation. They're not quite getting the information in the best order, or perhaps the balance of information is not quite right. And lack of practice. I think A lot of time is very often spent preparing the slides, but not much time practicing. Another issue, I think, is how the presentation is delivered. So not just what the students are saying, but how they're conveying the message. And a key issue, of course, is eye contact. And this might be because, again, if they have a lot of information on their slides, they're really using the slides as note cards. So they're focusing on the screen and they're not having much of a rapport with the audience. They're not making any eye contact. So this is very often quite challenging certainly for the students that I've taught and I've worked with. So this could be because they lack confidence. It could be, as we've said, because they have just too much information. Perhaps they can't remember it, or they have it all on the slides. They want to read the slides. And I've put here lack of language, but by that I mean lack of presentation language or skills using the language in a presentation. So, for example, transition phrases are really useful and I think key for helping the speaker and the audience to follow the presentation. Really helps with organisation. Fillers, perhaps, if students forget what they want to say or they want to go back to something, it's really important, I think, if they have some phrases that they can use to do that efficiently. And of course, familiarity with keywords. Now, if students are giving a presentation in a language which is not their own, or they're using quite technical words, then they really need to be familiar with pronunciation, for example. So just to summarize those first key points, I think timing and delivery together could really be improved with more practice. But the question I've been working towards trying to answer over my teaching with students is, how can we encourage them? How can we guide them to do this? They're very keen to produce the work and the slides, but perhaps they don't really focus too much on the practice. So there is, some of you may have heard of the Pecha Kucha approach to presentations, which really focuses on timing and design of slides. And this was something that began, I think, in Tokyo in 2003. A couple of architects had been sitting through lots of rather long, boring presentations and wanted to breathe life into the presentations and the conferences that they were attending. So they decided to introduce this time limit, 20 seconds for each slide. And they also put this together with the idea that less text, or indeed no text on the slides, would help the presenter to convey things more naturally and to have an impactful image rather than lots and lots of text and words. So this results in a very speedy presentation, hopefully very impactful, very visual, and keeps the audience focused. And they worked with 20 images and 20 seconds for each slide. Here are some keywords, or again a summary of the Pecha Kucha. It really focuses on organisation, visual impact, and some people refer to it as a lightning talk. In the business world, I think lightning talks are one of the key skills that they need to develop. And this has really spread in the business world, but also in academic circles as well, and various research has been done that really emphasises how important it is for speakers, for presenters, to be clear and brief. So really kind of limiting the amount of time they speak, but not limiting the message. So how can we use, or how can we utilize this approach perhaps with our students? So again, this is something that I'm experimenting with and practicing with students that I'm teaching at the moment on the foundation year. They have quite a lot of skills to focus on, spoken and written, of course. Seminar discussions, group work, essays, reports, writing self-reflections, and of course individual presentations as well. So in the past we worked on essay skills, writing skills, and we always of course used pair work and group work in the class, but it wasn't really until the end of the course that we actually asked them to do an individual presentation after many weeks really of studying. So we've really been experimenting with how we can get the students to do more impromptu presentations, presentations relating to written assignments and other tasks. So rather than just waiting until the end of the year. So this is just a few of the ideas that we've been experimenting with. So we've used the Pecha Kucha approach to presentations, but slightly adapted it to suit the different tasks that we want to use to do. So, for example, in the first week of the semester, we can ask students to give a nice brief self-introduction. It's not too scary because they're talking about themselves. It's not too long, it's only 3 minutes, and they can talk about their hobbies or their hometown. But it's just introducing them very slowly to some of these skills of thinking about timing and limiting them in terms of the number of slides they can use, as well as hopefully giving them a little bit of confidence early on in the course. Later on in the course, students are working on preparing a written essay, and we ask them to give a short presentation about their essay plan, so that helps them to organise in their minds what the key points are. But again, it's also giving them more practice. They're standing up in front of the class, we give them a time limit, we give them a small number of slides, we guide them in terms of not putting too much text on the slides, and then they have another go at the presentation. Similarly, for a seminar discussion, of course, we're working towards a seminar discussion, but before that, we have lots of reading and preparation. So if we can ask the students to speak about some of the key points that they've been working on, that's more presentation practice. And even when we do get to the final assessed presentation, we can still ask them to give a brief outline of what they will be talking about in their assessment. So just so that they get an idea of what they want to say, how they want to say it, and we can give them some feedback on that, which I think is quite valuable for them. We show them how to set the timing for the slides. So we said that with the Pecha Kucha style of presentation, it's very short, snappy. The slides can be set for 20 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute, whatever we want to choose. But then we obviously have to explain that to the students, and it's not really too difficult, I don't think. If they're using the PowerPoint, they can select to progress the slides on an automated timing rather than on the mouse click, which is what we traditionally used to do usually. And this really focuses them on the timing, because that's really crucial. before they start making the PowerPoint, we go back to a bit of old-fashioned pen and paper, and give them a kind of a template or like a storyboard. So this helps them to visualize the slides all together. So if students they're very capable with the technology, they go straight in, start making the PowerPoint, they're on the computer, they're designing the slides. Suddenly we find they've got 45 slides. So it's going to be too many, and it's probably not very organized, and it's probably rather difficult to organize 45 slides. So if we keep this brief, for example, only 6 slides, their first self-introduction presentation, they can look at the slides on paper and just make a note of what they would like to have on that slide, or what they imagine putting on that slide. It could be some various images, pictures, or they might make a note of some of the phrases that they want to use, particularly at the beginning, various transition points at the end. So just to remind them a little bit of what they want to include there. And I think if sometimes the students sort of think, well, you know, can we not just get on with making the PowerPoint? But if they take the time to organize and visualize and plan the story, if you like, how's it going to start? What might be the main points? How is it going to end? Then this should help them when they actually come to design the slides and the PowerPoint. And this was just an example that we used for the self-introduction, the brief introduction that they were doing at the beginning of the semester, as an example. I think at this point it's important to remind students that preparing and practicing is really so important, and to tell them that practice is not quite the same as memorizing a talk. Now, that's not to say that maybe sometimes they need to do some memorizing, or there may be some key facts or dates they have to remember or memorize for certain tests or certain work. But I think in terms of giving a presentation, it's much better for the students to be familiar with and confident with what they want to talk about, rather than simply just memorizing sentences and great reams of text. The danger is, of course, memorizing. This technique might work for a presentation that's only 1 or 2 minutes, but when the students progress and they're having to give perhaps 20-minute presentations for some later assessments as they go through work through their studies, they can't really memorize such a long talk. And I think it would actually be quite dangerous, because they may then start forgetting. They forget what they want to say, they forget what the next point is, and they come across as not really being terribly confident in their topic. So we really try and discourage the students from memorizing or from learning by heart. We do allow them, obviously, to have note cards with a few keywords and key terms as they're giving their presentation. But if they've spent the preparation time, then they should be familiar with their topic. And there are many different ways that they could perhaps do a bit of practice outside of class. For example, they can record themselves on their phones, and they could either do this just by, they could just record their voice, or they could film themselves so that they can get an idea of sort of eye contact and facial expressions and so forth. Of course, practicing with a partner or another classmate is a nice way to build up students' confidence without throwing them in front of the whole class to begin with. It's nice just to practice with a partner and to get some constructive feedback. Perhaps the partner can time them or give them some suggestions regarding delivery style, gestures and so forth. PowerPoint itself offers various functions such as rehearse and record. Excuse me. So if students have they've made their PowerPoint, they've not given the presentation yet, but they need to do this crucial practice stage, they can actually use the PowerPoint to record and to time themselves and to go back and rehearse and just to check themselves how long they're taking and how it's going to work out. Another idea is making a screencast. I think there is some screencasting software that's available free online, and it allows the student to record their voice and slides together, and then they can play it back, listen to it, and look at the slides at the same time, and they can assess if they think they've done a good job, if they've used transition signals, and it's just a nice way to build a bit more confidence. Of course, many of these suggestions students may find a little bit embarrassing at first, you know, presenting in front of a friend or a partner, but it really pays off, I think, when they come to do the final presentation. Note cards, as we mentioned previously, can be quite useful for just reminding students of the key points as they're working through their presentation, but really not encouraging or allowing them to write great long sentences or text. Another activity we've tried with the business students, you may have heard of Dragon's Den. I think in America, in the US, I think it's called Shark Tank or Shark's Tank, where speakers have to pitch a business idea for 3 minutes, and they have to make it really impactful and memorable, and they have to be very enthusiastic and confident. And with business students, it's quite a nice idea to use in the classroom, because the other students can be dragons, and when the presenters have given their business pitch, then the dragons can start asking their tricky questions and challenging them on their business plan. And I think that's a really useful skill that, well, not just business students, but students in general, and maybe people in general, can transfer to outside of the classroom into the workplace. So really transferable skill. Comments from colleagues. Now, various colleagues have tried this technique in various different forms with various different groups of students, and generally the feedback has been quite positive. Particularly, one colleague said that the presentations were far more engaging and well rehearsed, so not memorized but practiced, so students were coming across as being a lot more confident. And another colleague came up with and said that Pecha Kucha format restricts the students in terms of time, and therefore I think it forces students to be more creative, because they only have a short time, or they can only use a few slides, or they can only use images. They can't use lots and lots and lots of text to explain their ideas. And sometimes these limitations and restrictions really bring out the creativity in students. So 10 benefits of using this style of presentation with students. So I've tried to just come up with a few of the key points that we've touched on today. Fewer slides forces students to be very careful when they're selecting what they want to focus on and what they want to talk about. If we don't have a limit, then they will try to include everything. Again, focusing on images really encourages students to think about what they want the message to be for this particular slide. And I think that helps also reinforce their own understanding of the topic or the idea they want to talk about. If students only have images, or not only images, but mostly images rather than text, then it helps to stop them from reading aloud from slides. So hopefully this will encourage more eye contact with the audience. As I've said today, I think this sort of approach to presentations can be used in lots of different scenarios, lots of different teaching contexts. Another colleague of mine gets students just to stand up for a minute and talk about a picture, PowerPoint karaoke, I think it's called, where the students don't actually have a lot of time to prepare, but they're having to talk about an image. But I think this style also works well for assessed presentations as well as ad hoc presentations as in the class. Obviously, Pecha Kucha style presentations are short, so they're more likely to be practiced. And by that, I mean, if we set students a presentation for 20 minutes, they must do a 20-minute presentation, probably they're not going to practice it very much. Whereas if they're only doing a 3-minute or a 5-minute or a 6-minute presentation, then perhaps they will be more likely to practice it. It will only take them a few minutes to practice it, so they might do it 2 or 3 or 4 times. I think the great thing about having a timed presentation prevents the students from running over, particularly when it's an assessed presentation. They really need to conclude their presentation in a timely manner. If they don't reach their conclusion, then this will impact on their organisation grade, if you like. So it's really a useful tool, I think, for encouraging students to think about timing and to make sure that they get to the end of their presentation. From a teacher's point of view, I think shorter presentations are a little bit easier to manage and to schedule. Of course, it depends on people's individual teaching context, but certainly for larger classes, I think it's a little bit easier to timetable in shorter presentations than longer presentations of 20 minutes, for example. As I said earlier in the presentation, this style can be integrated into other tasks, so it doesn't have to be only an assessed presentation. It can be for different activities at different points throughout the course. So I think it's quite flexible in that respect, and people can use it how they want to, really. Shorter presentations can be more memorable and effective than longer, more detailed presentations. As I said, if students don't have a limit for the number of slides they use and they don't have a time limit, then I think it could be a bit dangerous because it could be rather long and perhaps not as effective as it could be if it was much shorter, in fact. So I think it's something to experiment with and see how it works in different classes. In terms of transferability, I think presentation skills in general are really key to the workplace, and of course Pecha Kucha format or Pecha Kucha style is certainly becoming more popular at conferences. Very often some of the big conferences will have a Pecha Kucha evening where presenters will use this style. So in sum, I think it's quite a multimodal approach. So it's not just the written word, you know, it's the voice, gestures, visuals, and it requires creativity, I think, to produce a really effective presentation. And it really focuses students on being concise and being selective with what they want to include. And in order for it to be successful, they have to be organised, and in order to achieve this, they really need to practice, but not memorise their presentations. So a couple of questions perhaps for us to think about generally. Do you think that students and people in general spend enough time preparing their presentations? And do you think that students and people in general spend enough time practicing their presentations? So for me, these are two questions that I often think about when I'm working with my own students and we're talking about presentations and how to improve their skills. And really that brings me to the end of my presentation for today. So I'd like to just say thank you very much, and I wonder if there might be a few questions that I might be able to take from anybody.
Lovely, thank you very much. Really good, Rachel. I've noted down a few questions already, but if anyone has any further questions, please put them in the questions box and send it to us, and I shall have a look through them. Yeah, plenty of questions. I definitely agree. Somebody said, I wish everyone could do Pecha Kuchas. I think I've done 2 in my life and they were terrifying, but if you can get through them and do them, you can do anything. It really does focus you, as you said. So let's have a look at some questions here. Do you have any tips on audience engagement when students are speaking? How do they engage the audience?
I think, well, one thing is we can ask students in the audience to perhaps think of 1 or 2 questions that they would like to ask about at the end of the presentation. So that's probably quite a useful one. And the other way, it depends what the situation is, but if we're sort of practicing presentations and we're looking at how to improve, perhaps we could ask one student in the audience to look at eye contact, and another student perhaps to look at gestures, and another student to comment on the visuals and the slides. So I think there are different ways that we can do that. Yes, yeah.
Excellent. Another question here: how do we boost students' confidence so that they don't need their notes? I suppose again it just comes down to the preparation, does it? Practice, doing it more often.
Well, yes, and this is what I was, what I'm hoping to do with the students I'm working with at the moment, is really just to build up slowly. And so I work with students over 2 semesters, so it's quite a long period of time that I see them. But when they arrive, you know, a lot of them fairly good at English, but really quite shy and not so confident. So if we can get them to talk about something they know, like their hometown or their hobbies, then that really just builds up from there. So the following week we can get them to give a little very brief summary on something they've read, perhaps, and just building it up so that when we come to the big assessments, they won't be quite so nervous.
Sure. How can we help students with vocabulary for presentations? I think that just means the language, like the transition between the slides, etc. And somebody else has written a very similar thing on, phrases to use or lexical chunks. Do you have any resources or any tips, or how would you teach that?
Yes, well, when they're sort of at the preparation stage, they're designing their slides, we try to elicit from them what phrases they might already know, because some of them do know some phrases that they can use, but we also have a bank of phrases. So, for example, firstly, let's move on. Moving on to my next point is. So we give them a few of these phrases and tell them to use just a few of them, so perhaps not all of them.
Sure. What about
build up like that?
What about somebody said, how can students appropriately start and end their presentations? What are appropriate ways of doing this?
In terms of introductions, we usually ask them to introduce themselves, so give their name and tell us briefly what they're talking about. And we also ask them why they've chosen this topic. And sometimes we give them a topic, so they don't have much choice. But if they have a choice, say, tell us, why have you chosen this? Why are you interested in it? And that kind of sort of eases them into the main body of the presentation. And then we try and give them some pointers with structure as well. So perhaps they need an overview, perhaps first main point, second main point, and then moving on to the conclusion. So phrases such as "to conclude" are really important and fairly simple, I think, for students to grasp, but really important in terms of the audience following the presentation.
Great. Just a couple more. What are the parameters that you use to assess presentations when the students are talking? What do you look for? What's a successful presentation?
Well, we look at language. So as we said, have they used some useful transition phrases? And also that covers perhaps topic-specific vocabulary. So if they're talking about a particular topic, I don't know, climate change, for example, have they used some vocabulary related to climate change, and have they used it correctly, and have they pronounced it correctly? So we look at language, we look at delivery, are they confident, do they make eye contact? We look at task achievement, so have they actually, this is for the formal assessments, have they actually done the task that they were supposed to do? And we look at visuals as well, so visual impact. Yeah, so I think those are the criteria we use, yeah.
Somebody, just an individual request, somebody's asked you if we could go back to the slide before the Dragon's Den slide. I don't know what was on that, but I'll...
Okay, yes, let me find that one. Oh yes, that was the one with the... this.
There. That's it, yeah.
This one,
there we go. I think that's hopefully satisfied one request.
Yeah.
There's another comment as well made by somebody. One activity that they find successful is something that is in like a game show. It's called Just a Minute. So speakers have to speak for 1 minute and they're not allowed to pause or repeat anything. I think they're just saying that's a good fun way of you can make it a game. You can make it a bit more light-hearted.
Yes, definitely. I think that's really important, is to, I mean, wherever possible, make it fun and engaging, and so they're not, so the students are not too stressed or too worried about it. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, but that's another question there, is how to overcome nervousness while we do presentations. But I don't know. I guess it's practice again, is it?
Well, practice, but again, different ways of doing the practice. So, I mean, they can perhaps, as I say, record themselves or do things at home, but also in the class, we can set it up so that they're working only with one partner. So they've only got one person to feel embarrassed in front of. It's not the whole class. Or we could have small groups as well. So maybe a group of 3 or 4 students. So I have a class of about 18 or 20 students. So if I split them into groups of 4 or 5, and then each group, there's one person having a go at a presentation and the other people in their little group are commenting and giving some positive feedback, hopefully, or constructive comments, it means that they're not so self-conscious, because there are several of them are doing little presentations around the room.
Yes.
So I think that helps a lot.
Fantastic. Well, I think we'll let you go now. No further questions, but thank you very, very much for that. Thanks for that session, Rachel, and thanks again to everybody that's attended, especially if you've attended maybe all or most of these presentations.